she acts innocent in court swears. She's the real victim.
Payne will continue today after we heard from her for the first time in court yesterday.
It felt like it lasted forever. It was like I saw my life flash before my eyes.
Then, the judge speaks a 21-year-old woman chased a stranger down the highway with a loaded gun. And minutes later, an unarmed man was dying beside his truck. She told police it was self-defense, that he grabbed her hand, that the gun just went off. But then the jury heard the 911 calls, and everything changed, because hidden inside those recordings was a timeline so disturbing, it shattered her entire story in front of the courtroom. At first, Hannah Payne looked like a concerned citizen trying to stop a dangerous driver, a hit-and-run crash.
There was just an accident. I'm sure they've already called, but I just witnessed it, and I just wanted to make sure that I guess called the police as well in case they didn't.
All right. Were they what were the kind of vehicles involved?
It's a red Dodge pickup truck. I think it's a Dakota. And a semi was involved.
A man acting confused. A dispatcher on the phone. But what started as a witness call slowly turned into something far darker. A pursuit. A confrontation. A gunshot.
It's a 96 model, give or take 97 model. He's an older black gentleman, gray hair, blue shirt on, and front end damage, heavily front end damage in front. Heavily front end. I knew he was going to do something. The lady in the Jeep was almost in the residence, so she turned around and she went after him. So she's going to take a picture of his vehicle and stuff. Can't even believe it. I knew he was something wrong with that guy. I knew it.
And a murder trial that divided an entire courtroom. Because the deeper investigators looked into that night in Georgia, the more one question haunted everyone involved. Was this really self-defense? Or a deadly choice she never should have made? The evening of May 7th, 2019 should have ended like thousands of other traffic accidents in America. A damaged truck. Insurance exchanges, police reports, maybe a citation. Then everyone goes home. Instead, one man ended up dead. And the woman who claimed she was trying to help would eventually be sentenced to life in prison. Before the gunshot, before the courtroom, before the headlines, there were two complete strangers living entirely separate lives. Hannah Payne was just 21 years old. She worked in property management, showing rental units, collecting payments, and sometimes traveling alone with cash. According to people who knew her, she saw herself as responsible, cautious, and prepared. She had recently obtained a legal concealed carry permit after turning 21, allowing her to carry a handgun in Georgia. To Hannah, that weapon represented protection. To prosecutors later, it represented something very different. Kenneth Herring was 62. He worked physically demanding jobs throughout his life, including mechanical and air conditioning work. Friends described him as quiet and hard-working. On the night everything happened, he was driving his red Dodge Dakota through Clayton County, Georgia. Then, in a single moment, their paths collided, literally. Herring ran a red light near Interstate 285 and struck an 18-wheeler on Clark Howell Highway. The collision wasn't catastrophic, but it was serious enough to stop traffic and leave visible damage to both vehicles.
I didn't want to pull the trigger. He's not have anything in his hand now. I can clearly see he doesn't have a gun. Doesn't have anything on it. going back and forth in the car, pulling it, turning it towards me, and she grabbed it all up, and next thing I knew, it went off.
Witnesses immediately noticed something strange about Herring. He seemed disoriented. Confused, unsteady, one of the people who stopped at the scene was an off-duty corrections officer named Terry Robinson, who had medical experience working in a prison infirmary. Robinson later testified that Herring's behavior concerned him almost immediately. His eyes appeared reddish-orange. He looked lost, detached, like something was medically wrong. Robinson believed Herring might be intoxicated or possibly experiencing diabetic shock. And that distinction would become incredibly important later, because diabetic shock can mimic intoxication almost perfectly. Confusion, erratic behavior, delayed responses, disorientation. Someone suffering from it may not fully understand what's happening around them, but standing there on the side of the road that night, nobody knew exactly what was wrong. They only knew something was. That was when Hannah Payne made the first 911 call. At first, she sounded calm, helpful, cooperative. She explained there had been an accident involving a red Dodge pickup truck and a semi-truck. She simply wanted to make sure authorities were responding.
He reaches out and kind of like hit my phone out and grabbed my wrist. Okay. So he grabbed my wrist. We kind of started going back and forth, fighting.
Nothing about the call suggested what was coming next. For nearly 20 minutes, everyone remained at the crash scene waiting for police to arrive. But officers never came. And then suddenly, everything changed. Kenneth Herring got back into his truck and drove away. The moment shocked everyone standing there. Robinson immediately called 911 again.
Intersection of Phoenix Boulevard in Riverdale, right before the highway. Is this woman, it was like a merging lane, and then,
Sounding frustrated and alarmed as he described Herring's condition to dispatchers. He explained that they had tried convincing him to stay put, but Herring wasn't listening. Then, while still on the phone, Robinson watched the truck pull away from the scene. But one detail in that call would later become critical evidence. Robinson mentioned that the woman in the Jeep, Hannah Payne, had turned around and started following him. At the time, it may have sounded reasonable. A witness trying to help police identify a fleeing driver. But over the next few minutes, what Hannah Payne chose to do would become the center of a murder case. As Payne continued driving behind Herring, she called 911 again herself. This call would later be played repeatedly during trial, and prosecutors believed it revealed her mindset in real time. At first, Payne told dispatchers she believed Herring was drunk and dangerous. She explained she didn't want him hurting anyone else. Then dispatch asked a simple question. Can you get his tag number? That should have been the end of it. But instead, Payne answered, no, but I'm catching up to him right now. That sentence changed everything. Because from that moment forward, prosecutors argued Hannah Payne stopped being a witness and became an active participant. Not once, multiple times, the operator emphasized they wanted her safe and instructed her to stop following the truck. But Payne ignored the warning, and the audio captured something chilling unfolding in real time. You can actually hear her determination growing during the call. She wasn't backing off. Even after obtaining Herring's license plate information, The very reason she claimed she followed him, she still refused to stop. Dispatchers instructed her to return to the crash scene because officers were already responding there. But Payne made her decision crystal clear. She told them she wasn't going anywhere because she believed Herring was dangerous. To prosecutors, that statement mattered enormously because legally, Hannah Payne was not a police officer. She had no authority to detain Kenneth Herring, no authority to stop him, no authority to confront him with a firearm. Yet she kept following him anyway. For roughly a mile, Payne pursued the damaged Dodge Dakota through traffic until both vehicles reached the intersection of Riverdale Road and Forest Parkway. And this is where the situation crossed a line that prosecutors would later describe as irreversible. Instead of simply observing from a distance, Hannah Payne used her Jeep to cut Herring off. She blocked his truck, then she got out. The dispatcher was still on the line, still listening, still trying to understand what was happening. Seconds later, chaos exploded. According to Payne, she approached the truck, intending only to stop Herring until police arrived. She later claimed that Herring suddenly became aggressive, grabbed her wrist, pulled her toward the vehicle, and threatened her. She said she feared for her life. Then came the gunshot. One single round struck Kenneth Herring in the abdomen, and within moments, the entire situation transformed from a traffic incident into a homicide investigation. But what happened immediately after the shooting would become one of the most scrutinized parts of the entire case. Because Payne's words on the 911 call sounded nothing like panic, nothing like shock. Instead, prosecutors argued they sounded defensive, calculated, even angry. As she spoke to dispatch, Payne repeatedly insisted that Herring had pulled the trigger himself during the struggle. At one point, the dispatcher reminded her, "You were not supposed to follow him," and Payne fired back instantly. "He hit my car. Not I didn't mean to shoot him. Not please help him. Not oh my god." What happened next would only deepen the controversy surrounding the case. Police officers arrived to a scene filled with confusion, shouting, and adrenaline. Kenneth Herring was still inside his truck, suffering from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. Nearby witnesses immediately pointed officers toward Hannah Payne. The woman in the Jeep, the woman with the gun. Officers quickly secured the weapon and began separating everyone at the scene. But almost immediately, investigators noticed something unusual about Payne's behavior. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't collapsing in tears. Witnesses later testified that she appeared strangely calm. One bystander would eventually tell the jury that Payne acted as though she believed she had done nothing wrong. Another described her demeanor as emotionless, even after a man had been fatally shot just feet away from her. But Payne insisted the shooting was an accident. According to her version of events, Kenneth Herring had grabbed her wrist, ripped her shirt, and tried pulling her into the truck. She claimed she feared he might reach for a weapon, and during the struggle, the gun discharged. Investigators documented scratches on Payne's neck and redness on her wrist. Her torn clothing appeared consistent with some type of physical altercation. She also claimed her acrylic nails had broken during the struggle and removed them while waiting at the police station. For a moment, those injuries seemed to support her story. Then investigators started examining the physical evidence more closely. The firearm belonged to Payne. Her DNA covered the weapon. Testing for Herring's DNA came back inconclusive. And perhaps most damaging of all, the mechanics of the handgun itself raised serious questions about her explanation. Detectives testified that the firearm included safety features that made an accidental discharge during a struggle far less likely. Prosecutors argued the trigger required deliberate pressure. In other words, someone had to pull it. The defense fought back hard. They pointed to the knife found inside Herring's truck. They emphasized Payne's injuries. They argued she was a terrified young woman trying to stop someone she genuinely believed was dangerous. But prosecutors saw the entire incident differently. To them, this was never self-defense, because self-defense law has one major complication. It becomes much harder to claim you feared for your life when you are the one who initiated the confrontation. And prosecutors believed the evidence showed exactly that. Hannah Payne had chosen to chase Herring, chosen to ignore dispatch instructions, chosen to block his truck, chosen to get out with a loaded firearm, and step by step, decision by decision, prosecutors argued she created the deadly situation herself. Then came another major blow to the defense. Toxicology reports, despite early suspicions, Kenneth Herring was not drunk, no alcohol, no illegal drugs. Nothing that supported the theory prosecutors said Payne had convinced herself of during the chase. Investigators later acknowledged Herring may have been suffering from a medical issue like diabetic shock, something that could explain his confusion and behavior after the crash. Needles found in his truck likely related to medical treatment, not criminal activity. Suddenly, the image of a reckless drunk driver began collapsing, and in its place emerged something far more tragic. An older man, possibly experiencing a medical emergency, chased down and killed by a stranger. The case slowly moved through the court system. Delays piled up. The pandemic stalled proceedings. Legal complications stretched the timeline even further. Meanwhile, Kenneth Herring's family waited year after year. Finally, in December 2023, the trial began in Clayton County Superior Court. By then, Hannah Payne was 25 years old. And for the first time, a jury would hear everything. The 911 calls, the eyewitness testimony, the forensic evidence, the body camera footage. When Hannah Payne took the stand, the courtroom listened carefully. She told jurors she believed she was helping. She claimed she misunderstood the dispatcher's warnings and thought continuing to follow Herring was the responsible thing to do. She described feeling terrified during the confrontation and insisted she never intentionally fired the gun. At points during her testimony, she became emotional. She described Herring grabbing her neck, pulling her toward the truck, threatening her. She told jurors she truly believed she might die. But prosecutors focused on inconsistency, differences between what she told officers immediately after the shooting and what she later said in court. Then they returned again and again to the same central question. Why pursue him at all? Why continue after getting the license plate? Why block his truck? Why escalate the situation? And perhaps most importantly, Why introduce a firearm into a confrontation that never needed to happen? Witness testimony only strengthened the prosecution's argument. One witness recalled hearing Payne scream aggressively at Herring to get out of the vehicle. Others described her demeanor after the shooting as cold and detached. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom had spent days reconstructing every second of the encounter. The defense pleaded with jurors to see Payne as inexperienced, naive, and overwhelmed. A young woman who made terrible decisions while trying to do what she believed was right. But prosecutors framed the case as something much simpler: choice. Every critical moment, they argued, came from Hannah Payne's own decisions. She chose to chase. She chose to confront. She chose to pull out a gun. And Kenneth Herring paid for those choices with his life. On December 12, 2023, the jury reached its verdict. The courtroom fell silent. As each count was read aloud, Hannah Payne lowered her head and cried. Guilty of malice murder, guilty of felony murder, guilty of aggravated assault, guilty of false imprisonment, guilty on multiple firearm charges. The jury rejected self-defense completely. 3 days later, Kenneth Herring's family stood before the court during sentencing. One of his sisters described the pain of watching her brother's casket close forever, a moment she said mirrored watching Payne leave the courtroom crying after conviction. Only one of those doors, she reminded the judge, would never open again. The prosecution asked for severe punishment, arguing Payne had never fully accepted responsibility for what happened. The defense begged for mercy. The judge ultimately sentenced Hannah Payne to life with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 13 years for false imprisonment and firearm charges. She will not become eligible for parole until decades into the future. Most of her adult life will be spent behind bars. Today, Payne continues appealing her conviction before the Georgia Supreme Court. Her legal team argues mistakes were made during trial, including questions surrounding citizens' arrest laws and defense strategy. But for Kenneth Herring's family, the legal arguments change nothing. A man who survived the initial crash never made it home, and one decision made in anger, fear, or determination, depending on who you believe, destroyed 2 lives forever. Because in the end, this case was never only about a gunshot. It was about escalation. About what happens when ordinary people decide to take the law into their own hands. And about how a single moment of perceived righteousness can spiral into irreversible tragedy. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a tense situation isn't rage. It's the belief that you are justified.